waiting a long time to interview this guest today. We've known each other for years via LinkedIn, and I wanted to make sure that Jeff Ikler had something very specific in our topic that I knew he would shine in. And today is the day, and I'm so grateful and eager to get this conversation started. Jeff, thank you for joining me.
Oh, this is a thrill for me because I've been a follower, of yours for years. And we have great conversations offline. So I'm really looking forward to this one.
Excellent. Well, for our listeners, Jeff and I met on LinkedIn years ago, and he came to my No Longer Virtual conference twice. And we have connected on so many different levels. But the thing that always drives me about Jeff is his not just love for history, but for the way that he shares the stories of history that light him up. And when you hear his passion in the words that he uses and following his writing, which I highly recommend, you will want to learn more about Jeff. So I invited him on this episode because I've been thinking about the concepts of authenticity, identity, and human relevance, which we all need and crave. And sometimes we go about finding it in really unproductive ways. And Jeff just had me, he just interviewed me on his current iteration of a podcast about curiosity. And he asked me what I was curious about. And it was exactly those themes. And I finally realized this is the topic to bring Jeff onto my podcast about. So Jeff, when you think of identity and authenticity, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I've been thinking about this, coming from our previous discussions. And in terms of identity, and this is so interesting, what pops into your head right away is work, and how work has defined me since my early teens. And I go all the way back to when I started working for the Park Ridge, Illinois News Company. I was delivering newspapers. I was stuffing newspapers. We would stuff all the ads and the television flyers and what have you into the main paper on Saturday evenings. We would work late into the night so that all these papers could be delivered on Sunday. And it was a blast. I loved doing it. I met a lot of older guys. I learned a lot of words that I had no business learning.
How old were you?
I was at that point, I was like 12 or 13,
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Okay. And nothing I would share with my parents, but the focus on work was really something that I inherited from both my parents. My dad came of age during the Great Depression. Literally, all the stories that we heard growing up were about trying to find work, trying to earn money from work so that he could bring money back to the family and things like that. The world of work was his world. There was no frivolity, if you will, in the stories. And one of the early stories, my father and mother met during World War II. She was his administrative assistant. He was managing a factory that built diesel engines for the Navy, and that's when they met. So there's a work connection. When they got married, they started selling ice cream toppings out of their automobile in the mountains of Colorado. So there was another work-related story. Everything was work. And I learned at an early age that, and I think I probably saw this subconsciously, Sarah, is that my dad especially, he would light up when I was working because work was valued, work was productive, work meant something. And he could not identify with the normal things that a teenager was going through, like wanting to be in sports or wanting to join clubs at school. He couldn't understand that. So there was never any connection there. But when I started working at the grocery store, and he had to, this was before I had my license, he had to take me and drop me off. He would be waiting in the parking lot when I finished, and he would say, "How was it? How was, what did you do today? What shelves did you stock?" And he would get all excited because it was work, right? It was related to work, and he could understand that. So that's
one thing you could connect on.
Exactly. And I can go all the way through, education, and when I was working for publishing companies and teaching, and it's the same thing. It's all, my identity has always revolved around work.
Mm. When I think of you, and when I think of this external view of you, your identity to me is this combination of all of those experiences that you had. And it comes together to create this very intelligent, warm, very thoughtful and considered and considerate human. That's your identity to me. And it is wrapped up in your work, but tangentially, because it's that combination of all of your experiences that make you who you are. So when you think of the words you would want people to use to describe you, do you think in terms of how that relates to your identity?
Well, the words that people have used to describe me, two come to mind. One is creative, and the other, very related, is innovative.
Hmm.
And again, they're work related. They were born out of the work that I did both in my classroom and in the publishing company that I worked for so long. So, and they're two words that light me up.
Right. Well, they're work related, but they aren't defined by a particular job or a particular role. It's not defined by your title.
Right.
Those are the reason I'm going here is as as part of my book, I talk a lot about your values and how you can demonstrate those through your stories. At one point in the book, I talk about how I found my purpose, how I found my why. And it was related to work, absolutely, but it was also related to where I found that I was most engaged and most satisfied. So that wasn't just work. When I really started to look at it, I noticed it was also when I entertained in my home, when I fed people at my dining room table. But it was all part of the same thing. That's work. Just because I love it doesn't mean it's not work.
Right. I was thinking, there are other places, certainly, that creativity and innovation surface other than traditional work. And I was thinking about the question that you always start with historically, because I've listened to quite a number of your episodes over the years. And it's like, well, what do people not know about you? Right. And I don't know if I ever told you this, Sarah, but I write screenplays as a hobby. And I entered a number of screenwriting contests. This was years ago, but the one I entered, the Nantucket Film Festival, which is one of the most respected contests. I was actually a runner-up for the top prize.
Wow, I did not know that, Jeff.
And screenwriting, all this to say, screenwriting for me, it's a very creative, innovative process. It gets me in that flow where I can lose myself for hours. And it feeds part of my soul, I guess. And when I can't do it or don't do it, I notice that something is lacking.
This is just triggering all kinds of thoughts in my head. Like I have these little sparks going off in my head, like rubbing something hard against sandpaper, making sparks go flying.
Right.
And I want to start with my whole blog writing journey shifted when I met Whitney Johnson, who wrote Disrupt Yourself and Building an A-Team. When I read a guest blog post on her website about a woman who had given up a six-figure career to go be an artist. And at the end, I realized she had a lot of luxury. She could do that.
Right.
Most of us couldn't give up a career to go not make money. Income is important. So when I wrote Whitney Johnson an email, I don't know what got into me, but I thought, well, LinkedIn is kind of leveling the playing field. I had met her. We had talked a little bit in messages, and I wrote her a message and I said, I really liked the beginning of this guest blog post, but I have to tell you, I could not relate to it because this woman has luxury. And I don't know who your audience is, but none of the people I know could just give up income to not make income and go find a nice quiet cabin in New England to go write.
Exactly.
I don't know who your audience is, but that turned me off a little bit. And I just had to share that with you. And she said, well, tell me your story then. I'll post it. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's totally calling me out on my call out. It's like, well, you try it then. See if you can do better. And I wrote a blog post about this performance. All of a sudden, I had become a paid vocalist, a professional musician. This was around that same time that I had gotten my first paycheck as a professional musician. And what I wrote about was, if you have a dream and you are doing it, do you have to make income to accept that you have realized that dream? Does it have to be tied to making money?
Yeah.
And it comes back to that whole identity thing. If you're not making money by it, then are you still an artist? Of course you are. But we have such a hard time accepting that label, even if we want it and crave it. I want to be labeled a screenplay writer. But as long as you're not making income from it, can you call yourself that? And I believe you can, because you're writing screenplays. Whether anyone buys one is not going to define that success. So I don't know if this translates, but I keep coming back to this whole idea that our identity isn't necessarily the work we do, like a particular job, but it's what we bring to it.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, why I took up screenwriting to begin with. And for many, many years, most of my mid-adult life, I'll say, I had nothing but traditional work. I had no outside interests, no outside gigs. I was working often 6.5 days a week at the publishing company, and it cost me a lot to do that. And I needed to find something where I could invest in myself outside of that. And I had always been interested in film, and I love the idea of film writing. And you know me well enough to know that this fits my personality, that film writing can be very formulaic. There's a very tried and true formula for writing movie scripts, at least the typical 90 to 120 minute movie. So it fit with my anal personality perfectly.
You call yourself that, but that's not what I see in you. But go ahead.
It gave me that outlet that I could do something outside of work. Mm-hmm. And that was really the impetus, the self-impetus to try to say, you don't need to define yourself by what you're doing here. I also shifted my mentality in work, and I think this is an important story. I was head of the social studies department at what was then the largest school publisher in the country, and I remember getting up in front of my department one day talking about that we had surpassed all of the sales targets that had been set for our department, and that we had sold X amount of books into the schools. And my department, your listeners can't see this, but they were all sitting there like this with their arms crossed, looking at me. And I was thinking, what's wrong that they don't get excited about this? And then it dawned on me, sales isn't what defines them. Getting books into the hands of kids and teachers is what defined them. And it was a watershed moment for me, because I was in that management position where I had to think about sales targets and what have you. But I had lost my connection to why I was really doing
behind it.
Exactly.
Right.
Why I was doing what I was doing. And it helped me considerably to think differently about the work, that it's not just about the bottom line. It's really about changing behaviors in the classroom and helping kids become more engaged and so forth and so on. So for me, that was a watershed moment.
So it comes back to this idea that you weren't defined by the job. That wasn't your identity. It was why you were doing it. And you could do that in lots of places. You just were doing it, especially during the pandemic, when you started interviewing teachers and people in the education field to help inspire people to bring what they could to the classroom and virtual classroom in that scenario. So again, your why was, how do we help students? How do we get students into a place where they're comfortable and safe to learn? And you were bringing all that, and it had nothing to do with your job, but that still remains part of your identity, that why.
Yeah. And the why, I think, is something that I've written about this in the book that I produce about change in education, or the lack of change in education. is that school districts, by and large, the people within the school can't uniformly answer the question, why are you doing what you're doing? And they'll go back to, well, I'm teaching biology, or I'm teaching history, or whatever, but there's no collective why that helps them move that school along on behalf of the population that they're serving, the kids. And we see this in business also, is that businesses go and they can't really answer, well, why are we doing this, other than financial information. So, that's been a big push for me in the work that I do. It helps get at your other point about relevance. Like, there's got to be more than just stock price, if you will. Well,
that's what I was just going to come back to that. So now that we've talked about identity and where it comes from and where it can shine, regardless of where you're sitting, what do you see as the connection between authenticity? No, we'll have to get into authenticity next, but identity and relevance. Now that you're thinking along these terms, where does that take us? Where does that take you?
Yeah, well, a couple of years ago, it took me into a rabbit's hole, and a pretty depressing one, because as a podcast host in semi-retirement, I had to confront why I was doing what I was doing. And I will admit to wanting to see my relevance in numbers. How many people were downloading a particular episode? How many people were hitting like? How many people were even leaving or clapping or whatever,
comment, or right,
yeah, whatever it was. And it was really depressing to see myself defining my relevance that way. And we always use the expression, we have to take a hard look at ourselves. It was by taking a hard look at my own practices that I actually extricated myself out of that thinking. because I said, well, how many podcasts do you listen to? How much time do you have every week to listen to something? And what are you listening to? How many articles are you reading?
And are you engaging with?
Yeah, and engaging with, not just clicking like, but actually, as I was talking with Dennis yesterday, Quetico, and I was saying, instead of calling what we have at the end of in our comments, why don't we put collaboration or communication or something like that, where it's not just a static event, there's some type of interaction involved, right? So I started thinking about, well, I'm only listening to 2 or 3 podcasts a week. And if that's the case, why am I expecting much bigger numbers from my listening population when there are now 3 million podcasts that they have to choose from? And everybody is publishing articles for others of us to read. There's only so much time in our day. And it really helped me refocus myself away from the numbers game to, well, why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you focusing on this to begin with? And what do you get out of that? That became much more important. I don't suspect, Sarah, that you have ever concerned yourself with the number of downloads or comments that people leave. You don't strike me as that type of person, but I went pretty deep for a while.
I don't watch it closely. I'll check every once in a while. And I get really excited when I'm in the top 1,200 of business podcasts in the US. I'm like, oh, I'm at like 1,100 or 1,085 this week. That's kind of cool. And then it's gone out of my head.
Yeah.
So you're right. I don't watch those things. I do struggle though with that look in the mirror, that painful look in the mirror. Why am I doing what I'm doing? If I don't have income as a result, does that mean that I'm not relevant in what I'm doing?
It depends how you define income.
Exactly. Well, am I associating incoming money for my relevance? Like if I'm a coach and I don't have clients, is what I'm doing relevant? If I don't have enough clients to make income that is going to help my family and my household, am I relevant? Am I doing what I set out to do? And one of my dear friends, Erin Freeman McLean, she's an attorney here in Helena. She walked me through this Byron Katie work about separating that success isn't just associated with income. What do you see as success? Well, yes, income has to be part of it because I have to contribute to my household and I have to save for retirement and I have 2 kids in college, right? But that's not how I define success. That is simply a metric for how I do my business. My success is dependent on, are my clients being successful in our work together? Are people getting something out of the book I wrote? My podcast. Is somebody going, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way? Are people changing their minds or thinking about something differently as a result of hearing one of my podcast episodes?
Right.
That's where success is. And I can tell you, after my last keynote, I would definitely say, okay, that's success. And I have to hold on to that. It's not metrics in terms of numbers for me. And some people, as a StrengthsFinder coach, I know this, some people, that's the only way they can measure success is by setting quantifiable numbers. And that's fine as long as you're setting relevant ones that you can actually measure. But when I want to come back to this whole idea that you went down this rabbit hole and you took the hard look in the mirror. What was the consequence of coming back out of it? What did you hear from people that helped you shift that mindset that what you were doing mattered, even if you only had, 25 clicks?
Well, heard from people is an interesting phrase. I don't know how it is for you, Sarah, but it's rare for me to hear from people. I did hear from one former guest last night who listened to a podcast where her nephew's going to a certain school where I had interviewed the principal. And that was like an end of year bonus for me to hear from somebody. I hear from former clients, coaching clients, and they'll recommend people like that. But I have to say, a lot of this has been internal for me. It's given me a lot more confidence looking at my work as a podcast host differently. It's given me a lot more confidence to try to go after some higher level guests, if you will, to not be intimidated because they're a household name in some places. And that, my inner critic used to say, "Oh, are you crazy? They're never going to respond to you." Well, now it's become, well, what could they do? They can either say yes, they can say no, or they cannot respond, right? So what do you have to lose?
And
right?
It has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, it's just like, well, they could be busy or whatever, or it never got to them because one of their intermediaries, saw it and said, well, so-and-so is too busy. He's instructed me not to pass these type of messages along. So it's almost become a game for me, is reaching out and saying, no, I have a good show. You want to be on my show, right? Mm-hmm. we and we can mutually help each other. So I'm still looking, and I think ultimately for me, this is healthier, is I'm still looking for my own voice to support what I'm doing, right?
Mm-hmm. So this actually is a really good kind of full circle when we talk about relevance and identities. How much of that is external versus internal? And I think it's a really important balance that we have to reach, because as Paul Howry and Brooke Errol and Rajkumari Niyogi, they all talk about belonging, that we can't do it alone. That's not how we're designed as human beings. So there has to be some aspect of external gratification, external relevance, as well as what you're talking about is that sense of accomplishment internally, to say, I am relevant because I feel this way, or I know that my work matters, even if I don't hear from others, because I feel good about it. I know I've put my best into it. So where do you go with that? How do you find that balance? Because I know how I feel about your work and how influential it's been for me. And I know other people who feel the same way in our circle, our no longer virtual tribe, and others outside of that tribe who know your relevance, you, Jeff Ikler, what you bring to the table. How do you balance that?
So it's a great question. And I can say one of the things that's very important for me in this work is how far can I take the connection? If I have somebody on the show as a guest, does the connection go any further than that Tuesday when I publish the interview? Do I get a response from them saying, this was really interesting, thanks for the opportunity, after I send my thank you note to them? And what's become very, very important for me are I won't call them connections, they're relationships that I've made with certain former guests, people that I met on LinkedIn, people who might have been referred to me or whatever, that we've now taken it to the next level. Diane Wiska is a perfect example, right? Mm-hmm. And we now talk about things outside of the work she does and outside of the work I do. And I comment on her work, she comments on my work, and there are a number of people like that. So the relationships, and again, I'm semi-retired, and I'm very sensitive to the point that you made earlier about, thank God I don't need the income. I'm not selling my podcast episodes. I don't have sponsors. I don't need this except for self-survival.
Relevant.
Yeah,
relevant.
Right.
All of us need it.
Yeah. And but what is really nurturing are those relationships. Kimberly Davis, Melissa Hughes, you, Diane,
Tom Dietzler.
Tommy, so it's, that's really the fuel there is where do we go beyond this?
No longer virtual. That's where we go. We show up for each other physically as well as emotionally and intellectually. I love that because it really speaks to me in terms of relevance. And I would hope that listeners are thinking more deeply about relevance in terms of when they retire or when they are empty nesting, well into our 70s, 80s. What are we giving back in order to feel like we still matter? And I've seen so many situations where people find really unproductive and sabotaging ways of finding relevance simply because they're not thinking about why they're doing it. And they're not finding other ways to be relevant. And this idea of connecting and building these relationships, you see so many people who retire or who age to a point where they stop reaching out, they stop building new connections, they rely on the older connections. And if you're within the same age range of those connections that you've known for 30 or 40 years, you're going to start losing them. And then where are you?
You remember the story that Melissa tells about the Charlie Brown Christmas tree and the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree.
No, share it.
If we don't nurture our connections, our neurons can begin to look like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. Like they're just these brown dried up things. With a few green. They're not leaves.
Pine needles.
Needles.
The needles.
And she said, but then she makes the point, when we start to nurture our connections, we start to look like the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, which is enormous and full of pine needles and whatever. So that's what I try to keep in mind, is that beautiful analogy that she made.
I love that. And they all have to be different connections. At the Atlanta No Longer Virtual, where you did you facilitated a session. We also had a session that I refer to as building your own personal board of directors. Right. And it was all about making sure you're surrounding yourself with diverse thought, with people who think differently and have had different growing up experiences and all of that. So that all nurtures our relevance and nurtures our trees to branch out, so to speak.
Nice.
I love that. Well, we'll have to tell Melissa that she was mentioned. Yeah. And I have to also mention one other of our mutual network, Heather Younger, who also nurtures those relationships in beautiful, phenomenal ways. So we are fortunate, aren't we?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's a good group, and ever growing.
Yes, which is awesome. So, Jeff, for our listeners, so all of this information will be in the show notes associated with this podcast at elkinsconsulting.com. So when you want to connect with Jeff and read some of his fantastic blog posts and listen to his podcast episodes, you'll be able to find those links on my website. Jeff, when you think of who you want to work with next, because all of this leads me to understand even more what a great coach you are. And I know you do executive coaching still on the side. So who would work best with you?
So thank you, Sarah. It's really defined by my philosophy, getting unstuck. And I go back to my personal model that I worked for years in a situation where I felt I was stuck. My feet were in concrete. I didn't feel I could leave the job that I had, and I didn't know which way to go. And those are the clients that I love working with, who feel that they don't have alternatives. And we know there are always alternatives. We just have to think differently about it. So anybody who has reached a point where they're really flummoxed, they don't know which way to go, they're stuck, that's who I'm looking for.
Perfect. I love it. Jeff, this has been such a treat. As I knew it would be, I knew you would tell great stories and we would have analogies and we would laugh. And I so appreciate your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's I've I've enjoyed it and I've looked forward to it.
Me too. Thanks for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. I'm putting some finishing touches on a new course, Get the Offer, Job Interview Storytelling, that will be available online in early fall 2022. It is so important that this course is truly relevant, helpful, and useful for my clients. So I'd love your help. Would you please email me at sarah@elkinsconsulting.com or complete the form that's linked on the blog post associated with this podcast episode to add your ideas for the course? I'd love to know your biggest challenges when it comes to job interviews, so the content of my online course is exactly what you need. I appreciate your help. Thanks in advance.